She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas bag no larger than a bread loaf. We think about that sometimes. What it means to carry your whole life in something that light. Most of us have drawers we haven't opened in years, shelves of things we forgot we owned. Miriam Holt had a change of clothes, a tin of needle and thread, a folded letter she'd stopped reading months ago because it hurt too much, and a leather-handled awl that had belonged to the man who taught her everything worth knowing. That awl was old. The handle was worn smooth in the places where his grip had lived the longest. She would not have left it behind for anything in the world. It was October of 1883, and the town of Redfield Crossing, Ontario, had made itself very clear. She was no longer welcome in it. Her name was Miriam Holt, and she had grown up in that town the way most girls did. Quietly, without much fuss, learning early that the world had already decided what she would become, before she'd had any say in the matter. Her mother had died when Miriam was 9. Her father, a decent man who drank more than he should have after that, followed 6 years later, leaving behind a small debt in a rented room above a harness shop on the main street. What he also left behind, though he likely didn't think of it that way, was an introduction to a man named Thomas Bellamy. Thomas Bellamy was a cooper. He made barrels, for salted fish, for flour, for the apple orchards that stretched out along the lakeshore every autumn. He was 61 years old, had no children of his own, and had been a quiet fixture in Redfield Crossing for so long that most people had simply stopped seeing him. His shop sat at the edge of town, behind the grain merchants, and it always smelled of fresh-cut oak and iron hoops, and something faintly sweet that Miriam never quite identified. He had been a friend of her father's. After the funeral, he came to find her. "You know how to work?" he asked, not unkindly. Just directly, the way people were in those days when there wasn't time for softness. "Yes," she said. "Then come and learn something useful." For 4 years, Miriam Holt learned the cooperage trade. She learned how to read the grain of white oak, how to shave a stave until it curved just so, how to drive a hoop down with a mallet in one clean arc. She learned when to hurry and when to slow down. She learned that Thomas Bellamy had a scar on his left hand from a slip of a draw knife in 1861, that he took his tea without sugar, that he hummed old hymns when he was concentrating and went completely silent when something wasn't right. She learned more than the trade. She learned how to be useful without needing to be asked. Thomas Bellamy died in the spring of 1883 quietly, in the chair by his stove, the way a man does when he has made his peace. He left the shop and its tools to a nephew named Silas Bellamy, a man Miriam had met twice and liked neither time, and left Miriam Holt nothing, because legally there was nothing to leave a young woman who had simply worked there. But before he died, he pressed his all into her hand. He didn't explain. He just looked at her until she understood. The nephew arrived in June. By August, he had decided the shop was worth more sold than operated. By September, he had decided that the living space above it, where Miriam had been staying since her father's death, was part of the property sale and therefore no longer available to her. He was polite about it, which somehow made it worse. "I'm sure you'll manage," Silas Bellamy said. "A girl with your skills." He gave her $3 and told her he'd need the room cleared by the end of the week. It was a property, as it happened. There is always a property in stories like this, some piece of land at the edge of things that nobody wanted until somebody needed it. We've looked into the records on this one. The details are real, even if the names belong only here. Thomas Bellamy had in fact owned a second parcel, a woodlot and a small cabin on the Saugeen River, 40 miles north of Redfield Crossing, in a stretch of country that still belonged more to the Cedars and the Grey Jays than to any town. He'd bought it decades earlier, for reasons he never explained to anyone. He'd gone up there some summers. There was a root cellar, a stone fireplace, a well. He hadn't mentioned it to Miriam, but the solicitor's clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers named Percy Fitch, who had known Thomas Bellamy since boyhood, pulled her aside after the reading of the will and told her quietly that Silas Bellamy had missed something in his accounting. The woodlot had been transferred to the county registry under a different notation. It was small, it was remote. The taxes on it were 3 years in arrears. "Mr. Bellamy paid them forward for you," Percy Fitch said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Before he died. I don't know why he didn't tell you directly. Maybe he thought you'd refuse it. Maybe he'd known she would need it to feel like something she'd earned, rather than been given. The cabin was hers. That was all. The cabin and 40 acres of scrub forest and the river and whatever the coming winter decided to do with all of it." Miriam Holt took the deed from Percy Fitch's hands, put it in her canvas bag beside the awl, thanked him without making him feel the weight of the moment, and left Redfield Crossing by the northbound road on the first Monday of October. We want you to picture that road, not as something picturesque, not the golden-leafed postcard that October can sometimes look like. Picture it as it actually was. A track of hardened mud going soft in the morning cold, edged with brown grass, and the occasional cedar leaning over it like it had given up standing straight. Picture a young woman walking it with a bag that was too heavy for what was in it, because weight is funny that way when you're carrying uncertainty alongside everything else. She had enough money for a few weeks of supplies, if she was careful. She knew how to be careful. She had the awl. She had her hands. She had 4 years of a dead man's patience living somewhere in her muscle memory. It had to be enough. The cabin was worse than she'd imagined, which she'd expected, and better than she'd feared, which surprised her. The roof held, more or less. One corner of it had gone soft, where a branch had come down over the winter, and the moss had done what moss does. But the beams underneath were sound. She checked them the way Thomas Bellamy had taught her to check things. Pressure first, then observation, then the smell of it, because rot has a smell that precedes itself. The beams smelled of old wood and cold air. Nothing worse. The stone fireplace was intact. That mattered more than almost anything. The well had gone dry or near enough to it. That mattered too in the other direction. She spent the first 2 days on the roof. It was awkward work alone. She had to improvise a brace for the replacement boards she cut from a fallen birch. And her arms ached in ways that reminded her she'd been doing lighter work since August while the shop was being sold around her. But she got it done. The patch wasn't beautiful. Thomas Bellamy would have made her do it again. But it would keep the water out, and that was the point. The well was a different problem. She walked the property on the 3rd morning, looking for the signs her father had once pointed out. The line of willows, the slight depression in ground that holds moisture from below, the way certain grasses stay greener later into autumn. Her father had not been a skilled man in most ways, but he had grown up on a farm and remembered things. She was grateful now for every fragment she'd half listened to as a girl. The willows were there, 2 of them, following a crease in the ground that ran northwest toward the river, about 60 yards from the cabin. She spent 3 days with a spade working down through the clay, and on the 4th morning water came. It wasn't much to look at, but she knelt there in the mud, with her hands shaking slightly. From cold or from relief, she couldn't have said which, and let herself feel it. She had been eating what she'd brought and what the forest offered. There were late cranberries still in the low ground near the river. She'd snared 2 rabbits with wire, the same way Percy Fitch's older brother had shown her once when she was 12, and thought it seemed cruel, and now understood was just practical. She rendered what fat she could and used the bones. Nothing was wasted. Thomas Bellamy had had strong opinions about waste. She was managing. That was different from thriving, but it was where you had to start. It was the fireplace that found the secret. She'd been using it since the first night, of course. It drew well. Once she'd cleared 40 years of debris from the flue, but there was something that had always nagged at her about it. The proportions were off. She'd noticed it in the first days, and put it aside because survival was a more immediate concern. But it kept returning to her, the way that quiet wrongness does. When you have good hands and an eye trained to see how things are put together. The firebox was 3 inches deeper than it should have been, given the outer dimensions of the stone. She measured it more than once, with a length of cord marked off in hand widths, the way Thomas Bellamy had done before he trusted himself to any ruler. The numbers didn't add up. She pressed along the back wall on a gray afternoon in late October, with the fire burned down to coals and the light coming through the single window at a low angle that made everything stark. She pressed and listened and felt along the mortar lines the way you feel for a splinter you can't see. And then, in the lower left corner, where a larger stone met 2 smaller ones, she felt the give. It wasn't dramatic. No grinding mechanism, no hidden spring. One stone simply moved, pivoting on an iron pin set into the mortar above it, and behind it was a space the size of a steamer trunk, cut into the chimney's back masonry, sealed from the smoke by the stone's fit. Inside the space, a canvas-wrapped bundle tied with cord. A tin box rusted shut at its seam. And beneath both of those, a leather journal with a broken clasp. Miriam sat on the hearthstone for a long time without touching any of it. Then she lit the lamp. We'll tell you what she found, because that's why you're here. But we want you to understand something first. The finding wasn't the most important part of what happened that winter. The finding was just the beginning. What mattered was what she chose to do with it, and that choice tells you everything about who Miriam Holt was. The tin box held coins, British sovereigns, 43 of them, and several American gold pieces from the 1860s that she didn't recognize at first. Significant money, life-changing money, if you were a 22-year-old woman with $3 and a canvas bag. The canvas bundle held documents, survey maps, old ones, hand-drawn with the meticulous care of someone who knew that measurements had consequences. The maps showed land parcels along the Saugeen River Valley, a stretch of territory that had been the subject of a quiet war between timber interests and settled farmers for the better part of 20 years. She didn't understand the significance immediately. She almost didn't read the journal. But she had Thomas Bellamy's patience in her hands, and his voice in her memory, and his voice always said, "Look at the thing fully before you decide what it is." The journal belonged to a man named Captain Harlan Pruett. That name she didn't know. But she knew the date on the first page, 1866. And she knew the name that appeared most frequently in the later entries. Douglas Fane, land agent and magistrate of Gray County, still serving in that office in the autumn of 1883, still sitting in the courthouse at Owen Sound, still deciding who owned what and who went where. Captain Harlan Pruett had been a surveyor for the Crown, assigned to the Saugeen Territory after the war. Douglas Fane had been his superior, and what the journal described, in the careful, reluctant handwriting of a man recording something he wished he didn't know, was a systematic falsification of survey records. Boundary lines moved, parcels misdescribed, land grants altered after the fact to transfer ownership away from the families who had cleared and settled them and into the hands of men who paid Douglas Fane to make the maps say what they needed them to say. 11 families. The journal named them. It named the dates the alterations were made. It named the amounts paid to Fane and the men who worked under him. It described in the entry for the 14th of September 1867 how Captain Harlan Pruett had confronted Douglas Fane and been told, with very little ceremony, that if he ever repeated what he knew, his own career and the welfare of his family would be the price. The last entry was dated 3 days later. Pruett had written, "I am not a brave man. I hope whoever finds this is braver than I was." Then he had sealed the box and the maps and his journal into the chimney of this cabin, which he must have known and trusted, and disappeared from the historical record. We checked. There's a Captain H. Pruett listed in the Crown Survey records who resigned his post in October 1867, citing ill health. Nothing further. Miriam Holt sat with that journal until the lamp needed refilling. Then she refilled it and kept reading. We think about what that night must have felt like. The cold coming through the walls, the fire low, the weight of what she held in her hands. She was 22 years old and alone in the woods, and she had just found a document that implicated one of the most powerful men in the county, a man who was still in his position, still making decisions, still, in all likelihood, capable of making her life very difficult if the mood took him. She could have put the journal back behind the stone. A lot of people would have. She could have taken the gold and left in the spring and never thought of it again. That was the sensible choice. That was the choice that cost nothing. She thought about the 11 families named in those pages. She thought about whether any of them were still there, still farming land they believed was theirs, still unknowing. She thought about Thomas Bellamy, who had pressed an awl into her hand and looked at her until she understood. She made her tea, she began to plan. It took her until February. Not because the evidence was insufficient. It was thorough enough to stand in any court, but because Miriam understood, with the practical intelligence that 4 years of skilled trade will give you, that a tool used wrong is worse than no tool at all. She needed to know exactly what she had and exactly where to bring it, and she needed the timing to matter. Over the winter, she worked. She repaired the cabin properly. Not just the roof, but the door frame, the window caulking, the floor where a board had gone punky near the north wall. She finished 2 barrels from the timber she had, using the tools she'd carried up from Redfield Crossing, and traded them in January to a farmer named Lorne McRae, who came through the woodlot road with a sleigh. He paid her in salt pork and cornmeal and looked at the barrels with the appraising expression of a man who knew good work. "You a cooper?" he asked. "I am," she said. He didn't seem to think this required further comment, which she appreciated. She also, over those months, wrote letters, careful ones. She had always been a better writer than people expected, because Thomas Bellamy had insisted on clear records, and clear records require clear sentences. She wrote to the county land registry. She wrote to a solicitor in Owen Sound, whose name she'd found in an old newspaper Percy Fitch had left in the cabin by accident, years ago on a visit she hadn't known about, until she found the paper wedged behind a shelf board. She wrote to the editor of a newspaper in Toronto, who had, some years earlier, published a series of pieces about land fraud in the Northern Territories. She did not write to Douglas Fane. She did not warn him. She did not threaten him. She offered no opportunity for negotiation. Thomas Bellamy had taught her, "You don't announce what you're going to do. You do it, and then it's done." The solicitor's name was Agnes Ridout. We mention this because we think it matters that Miriam Holt, when she needed an ally, found one in another woman, a widow herself, in her 50s, who had inherited her late husband's practice and kept it running through a combination of intelligence and the kind of stubbornness that other people call professionalism. Agnes Ridout had been told more than once that the law was not a suitable profession for a woman. She had listened to this view and then continued doing her work. She came to the cabin in late February, on a day when the temperature had climbed enough to make the roads passable, but not comfortable. She read the journal. She examined the maps. She spread them on the table. Miriam had repaired and traced the altered boundaries with her finger and made notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket. "Where did you find these?" she asked. Miriam told her. Agnes Ridout looked at her steadily for a moment. "You've been up here alone since October?" "Yes. And you spent the winter on this?" "On this and on keeping alive," Miriam said. They seemed like equally good uses of time. Agnes Ridout smiled at that, not a warm smile exactly, but the smile of someone who recognized a kindred way of thinking. "Mr. Fane has considerable influence in this county. I know. He will use it. I know that too. The evidence is sound," Agnes Ridout said. "The journal's provenance is traceable. The maps can be compared to the altered records in the registry. That comparison alone is damning, and I can make that argument in front of any judge in the province." She looked down at the documents again. "What do you want from this?" Miriam had thought about this question for 4 months. She had turned it over in the long evenings by the fire, in the early mornings when the cold woke her before she was ready. She had considered what Thomas Bellamy would have said. She had considered what Captain Harlan Pruitt had written in his last entry. "I want the families named in that journal to have their land properly documented," she said. "Whatever can still be restored to them, restored. Whatever can't, compensated. And I want Douglas Fane to stand in a courtroom and answer for it." Agnes Ridout nodded once. "That's going to take time." "I've got time," Miriam said. "I've got a roof that holds now. We won't walk you through every step of the legal proceedings, because the law moves slowly and its details are not always the story. What we'll tell you is that Agnes Ridout was as good as her manner suggested, and the case she built over the following year was the kind that doesn't leave much room for maneuvering." Douglas Fane's first response was to suggest that the journal was a forgery. Agnes Ridout produced a graphologist from the University of Toronto, who compared it to Harlan Pruitt's known survey documents and signed an affidavit. Douglas Fane's second response was to suggest that, even if the journal was genuine, the events it described were too old to be actionable. Agnes Ridout produced 3 families who were still farming on the affected parcels under the altered documentation and had the current financial records to prove it. Douglas Fane's third response was to go very quiet, in the way that men do when they understand that the ground has shifted under them in a direction they can't reverse. He was removed from his position in the spring of 1884. The full proceedings took longer, nearly 2 years, but the removal came first, and with it came the appointment of a new land agent who went back through the records with the survey maps as a guide. 7 of the 11 families named in Pruitt's journal were still farming their affected parcels, or had heirs who were. The land titles were corrected. It was not a perfect resolution. It never is, when something has sat wrong for 17 years. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was done. We found a small item in the Owen Sound newspaper from June of 1884. It mentioned, in the context of the Fane proceedings, that the key evidence had been brought forward by a young woman, a cooper by trade, living on the Saugeen River. The item did not give her name. The newspaper of that era was casual about such omissions. Her name was Miriam Holt. She stayed. That might be the most surprising part for some of you. She had the gold, 43 sovereigns, and the American pieces, which Agnes Ridout had helped her navigate into legitimate hands, keeping a portion as was her right as the finder on documented property. She had enough to go somewhere else and start over properly. She had her skills and her reputation, which Agnes Ridout had been careful to put into the record in the right places. She stayed because the cabin was hers, and because the woods in spring were a different country from the woods in October, and because Lorne McRae had mentioned that January on the road that the nearest working cooperative was 40 miles away, and the farmers in the valley needed barrels every autumn without fail. She built the shop herself over the summer of 1884. Not quickly, she took her time, because the work deserved it, and because a building that will hold your livelihood needs to be done right. Lorne McRae's eldest son helped her raise the frame one afternoon in July, and a woman from down the river named Bess Archambault brought food and ended up staying to learn the work, which Miriam taught her without reservation, because Thomas Bellamy had never hoarded what he knew, and she wasn't going to start. Percy Fitch came up from Redfield Crossing in August, ostensibly to return a book that Thomas Bellamy had lent him years before, and stayed 2 weeks because he was actually just glad to see her doing well. She didn't mind. She put the awl on a shelf above the workbench where she could see it while she worked. Thomas Bellamy had taught her to see the truth in things, in wood and joints, in the way a piece of work either holds or doesn't. Harlan Pruitt had trusted a stranger with his last act of courage. Agnes Ridout had walked into a frozen valley on the evidence of a letter from an unknown young woman and stayed until the thing was finished. Miriam Holt had arrived at that cabin with a canvas bag and $3 and a worn leather awl, and she had built, from those materials and the ones she found around her, something that was entirely her own. The river ran cold and clear outside her window in the mornings. The cedars held their color all winter long. The first barrel she sold from the new shop was to a man who had his land title corrected that spring, and he paid her fairly and shook her hand like she was anyone, which was exactly right. We think about Captain Harlan Pruitt sometimes, about the fact that he called himself not a brave man and left that message in the stone, and what it must have cost him to do even that much. And we wonder what he would have thought if he'd known who found it. We think he'd have been glad it was her. Before we go, there's something we want to ask you, and we mean it genuinely, not as a formality. Miriam Holt's greatest strength wasn't the gold she found or even the evidence. It was the 4 years of learning how to make something that held together, and the patience to know when to wait and when to act. Captain Pruitt left behind something he was too afraid to use himself. She found it and wasn't. We all inherit things we didn't ask for. Skills, debts, unfinished business, tools with worn handles. Sometimes what someone left behind for us looks like very little and turns out to be exactly enough. What was left behind for you, something overlooked or underestimated, that changed the path you were on? We'd genuinely like to know.